After they had finished singing, Jesus looked around the room. They were all so uncertain. The light from the oil lamps cast shadows on the faces of the 12. He had picked them all himself. Jesus took in a deep breath. "This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." The words hit them firmly, shaking the intimacy of the moment. Simon Peter stood up, saying, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." The expression on Jesus' face was very clear. He often got this way when his words were about to be very serious. "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered. "This very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Peter didn't believe him. Oh, this had to be a test. He declared, Even if I have to die with you, I would never disown you." The other disciples mumbled much the same. Jesus and the disciples walked slowly together to Gethsemane. It was a beautiful garden, a good place to think. Peter noticed that Jesus' feet, his walk was different. It was as if he was trying to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Each step was a labor, as if he knew what was about to happen. Jesus instructed his disciples to sit down. He walked over to Peter, James, and John. His eyes were half open. Jesus struggled to speak. He worked hard to breathe. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and watch with me." Jesus moved just a few feet away. He fell down. It was as if an unseen force grabbed him and threw him to the ground. "My Father," Jesus said, "if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." What lay before Jesus was a path he knew he had to take. Jesus believed and chose and was committed in his trust in God. There he remained on the ground. His hands grabbed at the dirt, clinging at the grass. Then, returning to his disciples, he found them asleep. Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" He asked Peter. "Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away again to pray. "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken unless I drink it, to be taken away, may your will be done." Jesus returned to the disciples. They were asleep again. His heart wrenched within his chest. These were his friends. They had all been there throughout his ministry, supporting, learning, and now, when all they had to do was stay awake, they slept. He saw all their faces illuminated in the moonlight. Every memory passed through his mind, much like a father looking lovingly over a sleeping child. Jesus took a deep breath and returned to the spot where he had been praying. He prayed the very prayer he had spoken already. Then he returned to the disciples. His words woke them up. He looked older to them. Something wasn't right. Something was terribly wrong. And before John could say a word, Jesus spoke. "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." The disciples all stood up. Peter noticed that Jesus had been looking at the entrance to the garden. Soon shadows crept into the courtyard, the dark menacing fingers coming from the torches in the street. Someone was coming, much more than one. As local collaborators, the temple authorities were permitted by the Romans to have a small military force, more than a police force, but less than an army. Judas had arranged with the mob to arrest the one that he kissed. Judas approached Jesus, saying, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Friend, do what you came for." Then the guards stepped forward and seized Jesus, arresting him. In a frenzied state, Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Jesus shouted at Peter, "Put your sword back, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Don't you think that I could merely speak the word and be protected by a multitude of angels? Just one word to my Father would make it so. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" Jesus walked away from the soldiers and picked up the ear. He returned it to the servant, putting it in place and healing him instantly. Jesus turned to the mob. "Am I leading a military rebellion that you've come at me with weapons to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all happened and taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." With these words, the disciples scattered, running from Gethsemane as fast as they could. Jesus was taken directly to Caiaphas, the high priest, and the authorities had all gathered. Jesus looked at the faces of those assembled. Their eyes were wide with excitement, unlike the disciples, who could not even stay awake. Peter, though, had followed at a distance to see what was happening. The chief priests were looking for any change. They were looking for any abnormality in the story. They wanted any charge that they could have that would enable them to put Jesus to death. Although many paid witnesses came forward, no charge that would stick was issued. Then 2 more witnesses came forward and said, "Well, this fellow said, 'I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up. Because there were no 2 witnesses who agreed to make the testimony against Jesus, it was custom for the high priest himself to seek a confession. There was no testimony of Jesus saying that he was the Messiah, the chosen one of God, so the high priest needed to hear it for himself. And he said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" Jesus did not even change the expression on his face. The high priest boiled in his robes. The veins in his neck bulged and shook. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus looked up. Quietly, he said, "Yes, it is as you say. But I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas tore his robe. His voice shook with rage. "He has spoken blasphemy! Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" Caiaphas was relieved. Jesus had stirred things up this week, and Rome had taken notice. If he had not been able to get Jesus alone with the help of Judas, they would have let him leave. There were too many supporters to arrest Jesus in broad daylight. It was better for one man to die than for Pilate's legion to destroy the entire city. But in unison, those gathered to find a way to kill Jesus spoke, "He is worthy of death." Then they spit on him, hitting him in the face and striking him with their fists. Others slapped him. One smacked him behind the head, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you?" Peter was terrified. Jesus had just been condemned of blasphemy by the Sanhedrin. There was nothing more that could be done, and so quickly Peter looked around. He didn't want to be arrested too. Just then he made eye contact with a servant girl, and she said, "You were with Jesus of Galilee." Peter growled, "I don't know what you're talking about." Then he slipped out of the gateway. So far, so good. Another servant girl called to him, This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." Peter denied it again, this time swearing an oath. "I don't know the man." There was a fire lit down the street for warmth. Peter joined those standing there, and after a little while of small talk and one-word answers, one standing by the fire looked at Peter and said, "Surely you're one of them, for your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." And immediately a rooster off in the distance crowed. Peter, remembering Jesus' words, ran away, weeping bitterly. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and elders came to the decision to put Jesus to death. They prepared to send Jesus to Pilate, the local Roman governor, as they themselves could not perform an execution. When Judas saw that Jesus had been condemned, his heart shattered. This was not the way it was supposed to be. He was supposed to convince them or call down heavenly wrath. Judas knew he was the Son of God, the Christ. He just knew it, but now he ran to the chief priests and handed them the money. Seeking forgiveness, he confessed, "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." Tears streamed down Judas's face. He ran through the temple, casting the silver aside. 30 pieces of silver, the same amount the going rate of a slave, cascaded across the marble floor. The Son of God had been sold for the price of a slave. The coins echoed throughout the walls, bouncing their metallic sound around the pillars. Finding a small tree just outside the garden, Judas fashioned his tunic around his neck. He tied the other end to the largest branch of the tree. Without pause, with no time for thought, Judas jumped. At that time, Jesus was presented before Pilate. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus stood before him, a Jewish peasant, already beaten, bloodied, and bound, standing powerless. Jesus responded, "You say so." "Don't you hear the things they are accusing you of?" Pilate asked. But Jesus made no reply, not even a single word of explanation. Pilate was amazed. It was the governor's custom to release one prisoner during the feast of the Passover. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them who they wanted released, Barabbas or Jesus. The crowd within the palace where Pilate stayed had been let in by the authorities. They had been prepped. They were not the same who had followed Jesus a week before and shouted, "Hosanna." No, that crowd would never have been let into the palace in the first place. This was a much smaller group. The other crowd? The authorities feared how they would react to the treatment of Jesus. That's why they arrested him in the middle of the night. Barabbas and Jesus were both revolutionaries. Both defied imperial authority, with Barabbas advocating for violent revolution and Jesus complete nonviolence. While Pilate was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife approached him, shaken. "What's the matter?" he asked her. "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." "Which of the two do you want me to release?" "Barabbas," they answered. "What then should I do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?" The crowd's long, haunting cry rang out, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" When Pilate saw that he could not change their minds, he brought out a large bowl of water and began washing his hands. "This man's blood is not on my hands. It is your responsibility." The mob responded, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Pilate released Barabbas to the crowd, but he had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. The governor's soldiers took Jesus to a large courtyard called the Praetorium. There, an entire company of soldiers gathered around. They stripped Jesus and placed a scarlet robe on his back, and then they twisted a crown made of thorns and forced it into his scalp. They placed a staff in his hands and knelt mockingly, shouting, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spit on him, took the staff and repeatedly struck him on the sides of his head, shoving and twisting the thorns deeper within his scalp. After they'd mocked him, they stripped him again, putting his own clothes back on. He was then led for crucifixion. Crucifixion was reserved not just for capital punishment, but for a very specific form of capital punishment, for those such as runaway slaves or rebel insurgents who subverted Roman law and order. It was always as public as possible to maximize its power as a social deterrent. The vertical posts remained in the ground where crucifixion took place, and it was right in line with Roman execution, supreme execution, that involved suffering and humiliation, like being burned alive or eaten by animals. The cross wasn't towering. The victim needed to be high enough to be seen, but low enough that the soldiers could hammer the nails into the frame, and then later so the dogs could reach the carcass. That way, there wasn't even a possibility for the honor of a burial. They threw the large timber onto Jesus' back. This piece of wood would have been no large burden to the son of a carpenter. Often Jesus had carried planks weighing more than this in Joseph's shop. But after being flogged with leather with bone tips, the wounds on his back tore with every step. The crown of thorns remained pressed on his forehead, often seeping and running blood into his eyes. He simply could not carry this load. He tried and he tried. There was just no strength left within him. Simon, a Cyrene, was standing in the street, and a soldier grabbed him by the arm and told him to pick up Jesus' cross and carry it. Simon tried at first to resist the soldier. Simon was reminded that there were many more crosses at the end of the line. Simon lifted the crossbar easily upon his shoulder. They were being led to Golgotha, the place of the skull. When they reached the crucifixion site, the soldiers grabbed the timber and fit the bar to the pole, still laying on the ground. Jesus was thrown onto the cross. His arms were tied across the beam to hold up his body. Large, rusty nails were driven into the space between his wrist bones. His feet were held onto each other on the vertical post with nails through his ankles. It took an average of 8 thrusts of the hammer to drive the nail in all the way. There are no words that can express the torture, the brutality of the piercing shards of metal that broke open the arms of the gentle shepherd. One soldier present at the mocking earlier that morning made a small plate. He hammered it onto the top of the cross, and it read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." The men crucified to either side of Jesus were bandits, guerrilla fighters or terrorists, freedom fighters. Their presence, a reminder that crucifixion is reserved for those refusing to accept the authority of the Roman Empire. One bandit hurled insults at him, saying, "Save yourself, King of the Jews. Let God save you now." The other one shouted, "Leave him alone. He is innocent. We're paying for our crimes, but this man has done nothing." Then he turned to Jesus and he said, "Jesus, remember me when you enter your kingdom." Jesus slowly leaned his head toward the thief, his his eyes opened, eyes that had not seen kindness in so very long, eyes that had witnessed such cruelty. These eyes now met the eyes of a lowly thief, and Jesus replied to him, "I tell you the truth. Today, you will be with me in paradise." From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness crept over the land. A supreme grief and judgment, a heaviness that defied the very sun in the sky. Then Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Those around the cross said, "He's calling Elijah." And immediately a man fetched a sponge and filled it with vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now let's wait and see if Elijah comes to save him." When Jesus cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. The temple shook under the velvet cloth of darkness. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The veil separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple sanctuary, the place where God was most present. So sacred was this space that only the high priest could enter, and only on one day a year. The earth shook and rocks split. When the centurion who was guarding Jesus saw the darkness and felt the tremors, this man who had seen so much done to Jesus, so much suffering, his heart shrank with terror. He looked up at the crucified Jesus and said, "Surely he was the Son of God." The Roman emperor was the Son of God. The centurion's proclamation was an observation that the non-violent kingdom of God had risen above the blood-soaked Roman Empire. Jesus was taken down from the cross, and not to offend the Jews. Having a dead body out in the open on Passover would be blasphemy. Joseph of Arimathea had to ask permission to bury Jesus because it was not customary or permitted for a body that had been crucified to be given the honor of a burial. But Pilate gave permission. Was it for all the Jews in the city for Passover seeing one of their own on a cross for Sabbath? Pilate had washed his hands, yet this act was a huge consensus to his Jewish subjects. Or maybe some connection he had felt with Jesus. They laid the body of Jesus of Nazareth on a stone slab within a new tomb. The burial clothes hid much of the bruising and blood stains. Mary and Martha wanted so badly to finish preparing the body for burial, but Passover was coming and was upon them. They would have to come back on Sunday.